So I know. That's yeah. And then, you know, I mean, ultimately.
Oh. Yeah.
And we talked to her. Oh, sorry. He said, give me the sign, and then I.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Kathy Hawks, Associate Dean for External Relations and Global Programs. Thank you for joining us, all of our students who are back from your spring break travels, and to our alumni who are joining us online, welcome. We are thrilled to be here to kick off the first iLead of the season. And so in just a moment, you'll hear from Dean Dave Schmidtlein and Tim Rowe, MBA 95. But again, thank you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you many times this semester. Over to you, Dave.
All right. Tim, would you join me up here at the, did we agree? Are you going to? As you wish. All right. Well, welcome students, welcome alumni. It's so great to have us start up this this iLead session again. As you know, we have alums online as well. It's a delight to welcome Tim Rowe back to campus always. Tim, thank you for spending this time with us. I won't do the long version of your bio, but I would like to just say a couple things about you, if I may, hopefully just to embarrass you the right amount. As you all know, Tim is the founder and CEO of Cambridge Innovation Center and Cambridge Health, CIC Health. Cambridge Innovation Center is a leader in the construction of innovation campuses, places where people come together to create innovative products and processes, and sometimes companies. And CIC Health, among other things, is the largest operator of commercial wet labs in the Eastern United States. Maybe bigger than that, but that's, I can at least, I think, say that.
Shared wet labs.
Yeah, shared wet labs. We don't have to say shared, it's big. It's just humongous wet lab operator in Eastern United States. And actually, we'll talk a little bit about how that came to be, of course. There are other things to know about Tim. One is that he is, as Kathy said, a 1995 alumnus of MIT Sloan. We're very proud to claim you always and today. You should also know that Tim gives his support to the MIT community in so many ways. And that's the part, it would embarrass you if I went on too long about it, I suspect, but a huge supporter of our students and of our alumni, certainly some who come across your transom and come in the doors at CIC, but also quite beyond that. You've been a lecturer at the MIT Sloan School and contributed your time and your insights to the school in that way, and of course today as well. And so I think there's much more that we could say about you, and if some of it comes up, more the better. So it would be natural to do a little bit of a chronology of you, Tim, but we're here and it's now, and now has been really quite a time. If you think about operating innovation campuses, which are maybe we would think physical locations first and foremost, during the last 2 years, pandemic, work from home, needs in the context of this country and this region's health system, and a crisis in Eastern Europe. And so it's been an interesting time to be in any kind of business activity. And if you could tell us a little bit about what it's been like for you and for CIC, that would be great as a starting point, I think.
Sure. First of all, thank you all for coming. Nice to meet you from a distance, and perhaps afterwards we can say hello, shake hands with anybody who would like to. So if you're not familiar with us, Cambridge Innovation Center operates a large innovation campus, as our dean mentioned, right across the street here. I think we're on the order of, well, several 100,000 square feet. I think in Cambridge, it's maybe 600 startup companies in those buildings. We also operate a center like that in downtown Boston, various places around the United States, and in 3 international cities. We're in the Netherlands, Poland, and Japan right now. And so our history, it was about just very snapshot. I graduated Sloan, went to work for Boston Consulting Group for about 4 years after Sloan, which was an amazing experience. Highly recommend it. And then left to start my own business. And that was Cambridge Innovation Center. And so I've been doing that ever since Sloan. Absolutely love it. What we're faced with now, or what we were faced with a couple of years ago with the closures, the quarantines, and COVID was this moment where a lot of people said, gee, I don't think I want to be going into a physical workspace, whether it's office or whatnot. I'll work from home. And so we had, I think at the moment, just as COVID hit, about 350 employees, millions of square feet around the world that suddenly weren't really being utilized. And so I think one of the kind of key moments was, gee, what do we do about that? If we had done nothing about that, I think that would not have painted a pretty picture for us as a business. Probably wouldn't have been able to meet our obligations to pay rent and all those other things that I think occurred to a lot of businesses over the last couple of years. We took some baby steps, which kind of snowballed, and I think it's become a little bit of an interesting story from a business perspective, and people ask us about it. Essentially, we started saying, gee, we'll offer free COVID testing to the people coming into our offices. And we thought maybe that would cause them to want to come in more. Turned out it didn't actually make that much difference. They still didn't want to come in. But in order to do that, we had to tie up with our friends down the street, the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, which is a large nonprofit wet lab that had worked out how to do COVID testing inexpensively. And we kind of figured out all the bits, like what you'd have to do to actually kind of collect that test and get it over to the lab. And then people started calling us and saying, hey, my kid's school would like to have testing so that kids can keep going to school. And we said, sure. And initially that was just private schools because they had the funds. Public schools didn't yet have the funds. And so we discovered by August of 2020, maybe September, that we had about 100 private schools, basically most of the private schools in the greater Boston area. And it was something we just were kind of doing on the side. It wasn't really like, we weren't thinking of it seriously so much as a business as just helping in the community. But we started having conversations with a leading light in the medical community, Dr. Atul Gawande, who some of you may have read his books. He reached out to us and said, I think you should be thinking bigger. There's actually a need for this on a societal level. Yeah. And could you actually take this kind of ability to sort of help do testing in institutions and kind of scale it up? And we talked to the Broad and people said, sure, why not? So we started doing more of this, serving businesses, some universities, started talking to the state. Some public schools started to find funds. One of the first ones locally was Watertown Public Schools, very close to here. And they found some funds and they said, would you help us to start doing this in a public school context, which was really important to us because we felt a little uncomfortable that the private schools had, kind of these resources, not the public schools. I'm a public school kid. And so it worked well in Watertown. And then Governor Baker leaned in on it. He said, we're going to do this in the entire state and we're going to pay for it. And so there was an RFP, a few companies, including ourselves, started offering these services. There was a second round of RFPs after a few months where they said, we just want one company to do all of it to be simpler and easier. And we won that RFP. So at this point we had started testing, I think that 97% of all schools, public, private, religious, you name it, in Massachusetts are doing COVID testing through us. A number of other states got involved and replicated most of the Massachusetts program, Vermont and Washington State, and we're in New York City and other places. And so suddenly we had this business that was not really that related to our core business. That actually turned out to be significantly larger than our original core business. And as a result, we were able to pay our rent. We were able to do almost no layoffs in the end, which was really terrific. We ultimately employed 3,000 new people, that, much bigger than we'd originally had. And the state asked us to help with the vaccination effort. We ended up collaborating with the Red Sox and the Patriots, and we opened those stadiums as mass vaccination centers. So if you got your vax there or at Heinz Auditorium or the Reggie Lewis Center, those were all run by CSC Health. And so we became, I think, maybe the largest mass vaccination operator in the country outside the government itself. And so this is all much to our surprise. But there are some learnings from it, and it was really it was kind of baby steps, and maybe we can talk about some of those learnings. I think the second question you asked was, okay, that's going on, and then suddenly we have this conflict in Europe, and what have we how's that impacted us? You might think it wouldn't really. I think a lot of us sitting here can kind of view, Poland and Ukraine and Russia as being kind of a long way away. But in fact, we had just, during COVID, opened a large innovation campus in the dead center of Warsaw, Poland. It's actually connected directly into the central railway station for the city with a tunnel. Like it's very central. And we immediately started seeing refugees coming out of Ukraine, and we're trying to think about what we wanted to do with that. We opened our doors for free for Ukrainian refugees that were displaced. Initially, it's all been women, because males have not been allowed to leave Ukraine yet, for the most part. And we had some space left. We're now completely full with the addition of the refugee community. We've created, we have 3 large nonprofits that are supporting them that have their offices in our space. And we've been coordinating donations of humanitarian aid from the West through these organizations into Ukraine. So I think you're a little bit curious about that, and I wanted to mention it. It's again, kind of to our surprise, in the sense we didn't expect to be in the middle of this kind of engagement as a company coming out of Cambridge that's really a collection of startups in a big building. But that has very much become the case. We're now on what feels like the back side of the pandemic, and we're feeling incredibly fortunate. We're feeling, economically very stable. The business is growing. We're now back to scouting for new locations for large innovation campuses. I've been in San Diego and Austin and Phoenix in the last couple of weeks, and I'll be in Miami and New York and a bunch of other places in the next couple of weeks. So, looking at these kinds of possible campus locations. So we're kind of back to that. And we're also thinking about, kind of what does the pandemic hold going forward, or other pandemics, and how might we relate to that? Which is a whole nother topic, but kind of that's where we stand. It's kind of a long answer, but thanks for having me. And that's kind of where CIC is today.
It's an amazing story, really. And I love that it starts with a sense to serve, and then scale, and then learn business processes that have some commercial potential in one way or another. And it's clear that you're not going to turn the clock back to what CIC was before this. I know there's more to think about regarding the future. One of the things we were talking about on the way over is there something to do in Africa that you all would find viable on some time frame, maybe not as a commercial activity, but as a way to serve and learn and maybe scale? And that's been an interesting model.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me briefly speak to that. So I'm a firm believer, as you can tell, in sort of businesses falling into their next thing. In other words, emergent strategy. It's great to have a business plan, but also just be ready for the world to teach you and listen and kind of respond as things come. We hired an absolutely fantastic designer and architect out of Harvard Graduate School of Design about a decade ago, who was Cape Verdean. He was living here. He ended up designing our centers all over the world. And then he said, hey, I want to move back to Cape Verde. And so we opened a small office there, hired some other local folks. And this has sort of started us down a path of saying, gee, how might we think about engaging more with Africa from an innovation standpoint? We've done the math. At the moment, what it costs to build the kinds of facilities we build, the wet laboratories and so forth, are enormously expensive, versus what rents are in most of the cities that we've looked at in Africa. They're out of balance. So there isn't at the moment an economic way to do this, and yet we feel that if we're going to build an inclusive world from an innovation standpoint, that there need to be these kinds of facilities and opportunities in all parts of the world. And right now we're in Asia and Europe and the US, but we're not. And we're in Miami, which is sort of Latin America, but we're not yet in Africa. So one thing that we are thinking about is, by the way, if any of you have ideas on this, work with the World Bank or someone of that nature to really say, how might we build a really first-class, world-class innovation facility? And that would be, probably in your Nigerias, your Kenyas, your Ghanas, Rwandas, maybe South Africa, maybe Cape Verde, but that sort of thing.
Yes. And MIT has some connections with some, we were talking about possible points of contact for that kind of public or nonprofit sponsorship as well. Yeah.
And you heard me say, hey, if any of you guys have ideas, and maybe we can build on that for a moment.
Yeah, sure.
In our kind of pre-conversation, these guys said, hey, what are the connections that Sloan had that were relevant to you? And I said, it's everywhere and it's all the time. There was one year where the majority of the Sloan Fellows class that had just graduated all had offices at CIC. And they were all near each other. And I think that included Brian Halligan and Dharmesh Shah, who built HubSpot at CIC, partly while they were still students, right? So this happens all the time. The proximate memory I have recently was we decided probably half a decade ago that we wanted to go to Japan and build a large innovation center in Tokyo. And for those of you who are familiar with Asia and with Japan particularly, it's on many lists, it's considered the most complicated market, the most difficult to enter. And one of the things that most people will tell you is that you need relationships. You can't just walk in and rent a space and do well. You need to be wired into the community. Yeah. And so I reached out to Tak Umezawa, who was my classmate at Sloan. We were in some study groups together. We really liked each other. Tak had risen to be the chair of a large international management consultancy for Japan. And also, I think they're global head of consumer retail. And he was at A.T. Kearney. And I said, hey, Tak, can you help me with this? Well, one thing led to another. Tak became my chair in Japan. And he oversees all of our operations there. We have an absolutely gorgeous, huge, beautiful facility, dead center of Tokyo. We found local Japanese investors for it. Another local MIT connection introduced me to the developer, which was our capital source. Another MIT connection introduced us to the only Japanese architect who's won both major Japanese architecture awards, and that architect designed the center. And so if you ever get a chance to visit CIC Tokyo, it's gorgeous. And it's now chock full of really interesting Japanese and international startups, all led by my Sloan, classmate. It was class of 95. It was a great class, by the way.
Best class I've heard.
The best ever. And so my point is that, these relationships that you are building in your time here at Sloan and through, kind of gatherings like this, these matter. It was in a room like this when I was a student at Sloan that an entrepreneur came in. He's a founder of a company called Diva Systems, which is a video editing company. And I think, your predecessor probably invited him and said, tell your story about being an entrepreneur. And he did. We all dutifully do, and you all should too when it's your turn. And he described what it was to be an entrepreneur. I was like, holy cow, that's what I want to do. And it's really like these influences. Some of them are in your classes, which are amazing. And I have some professors that I will be lifelong friends with and learned a ton from. People like Tom Malone and Ed Shine. Ed's not around, I think, here, but Tom is. Michael Scott Morton, some other really fantastic professors that I don't know how many of them are still here, but Some of that's that, but a big piece is going to be these relationships you have with each other. And guess what? You're going to need to go to Dubai at some point and grow your business. And there's going to be somebody that you can call. And that somebody probably is going to move mountains for you. And that's what you get from Sloan. And make sure you invest in that and make sure you're that person. If you're the one in Dubai, open the doors for your fellow Sloanies and you won't regret it.
So Tim, you went to this event like this one, you decided you wanted to be an entrepreneur, you were a student, and then you joined BCG, am I right?
Yeah, and I do
So
recommend that.
How did that?
Yeah,
how
no,
did-
and
how
it's
did that
not,
work
that's a
out for you?
very good call, but I will say I would absolutely do that. So nothing was a better education in business until I got to Sloan. Sloan was my best business education ever, and it prepared me. Nothing was better than 4 years at BCG after that. If you have the opportunity to work at one of these top firms, I was in 4 or 5 countries. They taught me a foreign language. I didn't really speak Spanish until then, and they taught me that. I worked for a year in Spain with leading Spanish companies. I probably was exposed to 12 different industries and their problems. Like fantastic. So if Sloan gives you the opportunity to work in that kind of environment, take it. You may want to spend your whole career there. That may be right for some people. For me, it was right to spend a few years there and then to apply what I learned in building my own business. And I think you wouldn't regret that either. We're incredibly fortunate to be able to be in this room. My grandmother, she did a decade of her life doing missionary work, not religious missionary work, but actually education work in Asia in the 1920s. And she told me that, we're fortunate to have our health, and if we're fortunate to have our health and our intelligence and a little bit of economic resource, then it's an obligation on all of us to use those things to do good in the world. And so find your own path. But if you're in this room, you're one of those people. And so find your path where you can make a good impact on the world with your skills and your knowledge. I'm sure you will. I'm sure most of you are already. It doesn't mean you don't have to work for a nonprofit. CSC is not nonprofit, it's for profit. But hey, we kept the schools open in Massachusetts. We won the bid to get to be the only company doing this because we were faster and we were cheaper than the alternatives. And that's what this is about, right? It's having good solutions to real problems, and people will value you for it. And you'll look back after years and say, I was happy with what I did.
So talk about jumping out of BCG then, and what led to starting this.
Yeah, so it was a fun story. So I was based in Singapore at the time. So BCG, firms like that, they'll ask you to go kind of wherever, right? And so they said, hey, can you go to Singapore? I was invited to lead a project as the project leader for Singapore Telecom on their internet strategy. And I don't know if this still works this way, but they said, by the way, you're going to be staying in the Ritz-Carlton for 6 months. It's like, what? It's true, fun story. We went to the partner, a guy named Patrick Forth, and we said, we don't think it's a good use of the client's money that we're all staying in the Ritz-Carlton for 6 months. Do you think if we found some cheaper accommodation that we could take the difference and we'll put it in sort of a pot? And so it would be much cheaper, but if we want to do things like bring a significant other out to Asia to spend some time with us, or maybe take some R&R in Indonesia or in Thailand, we could spend from this pot, and it would end up costing the same to the client. And he said, okay, you can do that, but just don't think of it as a pot of gold. And so we left the meeting, we're like, pot of gold. And so you can imagine what that 6 months was like. It was great. At the end of this, Singapore Telecom invited me to join Singapore Telecom to lead their internet services. And I seriously considered it. It was really exciting. And my spouse at the time, Amy Anderson, when she was at Sloan, I met her here at Sloan. By the way, another positive for Sloan. Then Amy Rowe. She was at McKinsey. And by the way, when we got together, we couldn't talk, right? But we could smile at each other. So they were doing the same thing. So I think she at the time was in Portugal or something like that, similar project. And we looked at each other and said, do we want to kind of step out of consulting? And if so, where in the world do we want to live? Is it Singapore, which is a wonderful place? We thought about it. We wanted to start a family, and we said, let's go back to Cambridge next to MIT. And so that sort of was the catalyst. We quit our jobs. We moved back to Cambridge. She had an idea for a startup, and I didn't. And so I said, baby, I'll drive your car. I'll set up the office and get the internet connection and the photocopier, and you do the startup thing. And then I'll eventually figure out what I want to do for my startup, and I'll do it next to yours. And so that was the plan.
Yeah.
Then Andy Olmsted, who was another classmate of ours from class of '95, great year. He was at AD Little, and another consulting firm. And he said, look, I want to quit and do a startup. Can I kind of move in too? Then a few other Sloanies called, said, hey, can we move in? And I was like, sure. And it got to be like 5 or 10 companies in the space. We were at 238 Main Street, which is the clock tower building right over here that's getting redeveloped. And I still hadn't done my startup, right? But I was hiring a receptionist and like figuring out accounting and, for this sort of shared space. And, I was finally like, okay, actually, this is the business. And as I mentioned earlier that I'm a big fan of sort of falling into things. Like, I think when you fall into things as a business, then it's probably right. Like there's a real need. If the world sort of if there's a yawning cavity that you fall into, that's probably, there's something there. And so, some West Coast investors, we're kind of falling into the original story, but, some West Coast investors, we threw a big party. They came to the party. They were like, we want to invest. We're really, and like, in what? And they're like, in this thing, this like collection of startups. And we're like, you would invest in that? And they were like, yeah. And they gave us ultimately $17 million to grow that, which at the time was like just an enormous, sum from our perspective, to turn that into what CIC, became, which was like a more professional innovation campus. And then, there's lots has happened since then, but it's grown a lot.
So you got more than a couple employees now, and you are the leader. There's a CEO responsibility that you have. So can we spend just a couple minutes talking about maybe what you've learned along the way about being an effective leader, or what you might like to share with this group about the challenges of leadership?
Yeah, there's a 20 years of making mistakes that, that lead to that, right? I would say there are a couple of things that are maybe interesting. One, early on, I had this idea that we should probably make all decisions by consensus. And so you'd get the whole company in the room and say, like, we have this problem, how should we solve it? And that was like a lot of fun, and it created a really cool culture, but it didn't actually work that well in terms of being able to move quickly. And at some point, it sort of, I realized that I was the leader and that I had to just make a call. But there was a transformation, I think, in my own head, that it was like, it's okay to just say, this is what we're going to do, if that makes sense. And I think businesses need that, but it took me a couple of years, and we made some mistakes before that. That was an early learning. A key learning is that you have to be experimenting all the time with new things. So we have built many new businesses over the years that are have spun out from our core business, and some of them have failed miserably, and many of them have been successful. But they all started from somebody saying, "Hey, maybe we should do this thing." So I'll give you an example right now that's on our plates. It's kind of fun. We create little communities of entrepreneurs around topic areas. This is something we've been doing for a while. So we'll hire someone who knows a lot about insurance, and we'll create a little cluster of companies that are interested in next generation insurance. We did this in aging technologies. So we had an aging expert, and we had 20 little companies working on the future of aging, that sort of thing. So I was working with someone who's an energy expert in energy, transportation, sustainability, sort of in that space. And we have this idea that we could maybe take the commuter rails and get rid of the trains and turn them into electric roads that have buses that run instead of trains. It's actually more economical from an energy standpoint. They can go every 5 or 10 minutes instead of every hour. And then you could sell access to that road to private electric vehicles that are controlled by the road. So here's just a concept. It's a really big idea. This has nothing to do with what we do, right? It's not health. It's not, buildings, the wet laboratories. So you can do this stuff. You can just, and we know people, and I've talked now to the governor about this. Like you can take these ideas and kind of before you know it, they become businesses. So experiment. Like be willing to try to lean in on something that seems like it might not work. Spend a little bit of money or time and let it go a little bit. And then they will often turn into something, and a lot of them won't, and that's totally fine, right? But some of them will turn into something significant. Yeah. I would say the last thing on pivots and crises, because we talked about this a little bit before we started. And so, if someone says, what did you learn from COVID? And, what would you tell other business people and so forth? I would basically say this. I'd say, if you have a major crisis that faces your company, and it couldn't be worse than ours. Like all of our customers don't want our product anymore, right? Which is, COVID hit and nobody wants to go to the office. They kindly, by the way, kept paying us, which was good. But we're on month-to-month contracts, so they didn't have to. And so we're looking at the potential to sort of lose our entire business. And those moments are enormous opportunities if you look at the right way. So we had 350 employees and we needed a new thing to do. And we were able to move so fast and so effectively getting into this COVID area because a little startup with 1 or 2 people could, and there were some startups, they couldn't compete with us the speed at which we could execute because we had this entire strong team available. And we were able to compete with the established organizations. You might have expected the existing healthcare systems to sort of step in and provide things like COVID testing and all of that, but they were all super busy. They were really good at what they do. They had full plates. So if you suddenly find yourself with a major crisis on your hands for your business, just make sure you breathe and then think, okay, what's the other way to look at this? Is this an opportunity for us to get into something new? You may be surprised at how effectively you can get into an entirely new area and build another business overnight, which is what we did. So those are a couple things that come to mind as sort of things that I've learned over the years.
Yeah, but part of what I love about that story is that what you're able to do now has, I think you would agree, been opened up by some of the things that you've already done. I mean, it would,
everything builds on the last thing.
Yeah, and
right?
so that
exactly.
So, but it is still a figuring out what doors have recently opened because of the last thing, and
Yes.
that's a part of the invention, maybe, or part of the experiment.
Yeah.
Is not only kind of a product, but seeing where the doors are. Maybe.
So make sure your team knows that it's okay to experiment, that it's okay to fail, that this is like, sounds trite and everyone says this, but my suggestion is use the word experiment. If you call it like a new business that you're entering, then everyone feels like they can't fail. But if you say, this is not a new business, this is an experiment, we're going to just try this thing and it will probably fail, but let's just try it. Then your team will feel more comfortable like putting ideas forward, saying, hey, I have a team member right now who last night sent me a real estate listing for like a big mansion in Lincoln. And he said, let's buy this mansion and turn it into a retreat center for startups. It's got a swimming pool, it's beautiful, right? And here's the math. They would pay this much and give this many days in a month, and this is what the mortgage would cost and so forth. That actually looks kind of okay. So why not go buy the mansion? And we don't own any mansions, we don't own any houses, but we could. So this is, just think this way as an entrepreneur, right? And make sure that your teams think this way, because you as the entrepreneur can't have all the good ideas. Try to cultivate this sense of like trial and error. Like, what's the worst that can happen? We buy a mansion for $3.5 million, which is this one. This business doesn't work. We're going to sell the mansion for about $3.5 million, right? So it's okay.
Although Tim, I'm imagining Series A investors who have just dumped 25 million into something.
It helps when you're not Series A anymore.
It's kind of like, end of the Super Bowl. We're going.
By the way, we're going to buy a
Tim's
mansion.
world. But, maybe.
Yeah.
But you never know. I want to ask you one I'm not sure if we're supposed to give these folks a chance to ask some questions too. And if we're failing to do that, let me not fail too long about that. But I just have a curiosity about that tough time and the pivot and the fact that you've got these, several hundred people. Did you set a date for yourself? Like, if we don't have a plan B that's working, that like this is, is that the way you
I
think?
had plans A,
or-
B, C, D.
Yeah,
Like, yeah, I mean, there was no date. The date would be, I guess, when
yeah,
they came to arrest me or something, but
Yeah.
they,
yeah.
I don't think they do that anymore if you can't pay your debts, but, but,
Yeah.
um,
Only in England.
it wasn't so much of a
That's not true.
date. It was, yeah, it was just like, one of these things has to happen,
Yeah,
right? It turns out a couple of our backup plans worked.
Yeah.
And I only needed one to work.
there is something though about the way that different people think about crises and think about risk and think about, I don't know, the people involved. And so much of what you've talked about has had to do with people as well as strategy, if you will.
I think that's right. I think talking about risk, what comes to mind is our conversations recently about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and privilege. So I think it's something worth saying is that as a member of a class that's done well historically, economically, with I know that like worst case, I can sleep in my mom's basement, like that I've got sort of backups.
Mary's a nice person. She would
Right.
probably let you do that. Yes.
So I think one thing that we all need to do is to make sure that everybody in our communities, in our staff communities, feels that they have the supports that they can take risks as well.
Yeah.
That we have people's backs, and there's real work you need to do in order to achieve that. It's not just to say that. But I feel incredibly fortunate to have the ability to sort of say, yeah, let's go buy a mansion, right? And it's important to understand that not everybody has that kind of wherewithal. You probably, by virtue of being in this room, have the opportunity to give that opportunity also to others over the course of your career. And so make sure you're doing that. Make sure you're supporting people to take risks, and maybe you'll be able to be the investor who backs them and says, okay, well, maybe you don't have those resources, but I do. That's also part of what we get to do, being part of the Sloan community.
Yeah. Should we see if people have questions for Tim?
We probably have time for 2 questions. And for those who are joining us online, if you want to type into the Q&A box, we will field those as well.
It would take a very brave soul to have a question. I don't know if there.
Hi, Tim. Thank you so much for your outstanding conversation here. And I would like to hear you about deep tech entrepreneurship at CIC. Can you expand a little bit on that? What's going on in terms of deep tech over there? Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to give a shout out to MIT The Engine, which is another initiative at MIT run by Katie Ray, those of you who know her, which is all about deep tech and supporting it. And I think they've done a better job than we have. And what they've really done is to say, look, we're going to provide a couple of key resources, some of the physical infrastructure, wet laboratories and so forth that are needed for some of these businesses, but also some capital that's really willing to take bigger risks around deep tech. I think so. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, deep tech it's a popular word these days, and it tends to refer to both technology, which is kind of hard, like let's build a new material that's stronger than concrete, that by playing with the atoms in the structure, that sort of thing. But as opposed to let's have a website that sells pizza more efficiently. That's not deep tech, right? So but it really covers a lot, from AI applications to materials to some of the life sciences development, particularly around genetic research. Within deep tech, probably the other piece of it is that it's coded to mean tech that's hard normally to get people to invest in. This is the stuff which is like a little farther from commercialization, and it's going to take a little more time to get there. So the number one thing that deep tech really needs is the kind of capital that's willing to support these bigger, these kind of reach type, reach for the stars kinds of companies. So we're not a capital provider. We're not an investor. We're an innovation campus, the physical space where you do the research. Cambridge is probably the best place in the world to pursue deep tech. There are some amazing places in the world to build companies. The West Coast is second to none in terms of the amount of money that's flowing and the range of things that they do, but it does tend to be less deep as a general rule. I'm not saying that there isn't good deep tech there, but it tends to focus more on consumer internet and that sort of thing. This Cambridge cluster, from the math of it is usually the sort of second largest venture capital market in the world. But when you look at what people actually put the money into, it tends to be these deep tech kinds of areas. Why are we strong at that? The collection of institutions here is amazing. Between Harvard and MIT and Tufts and BU and Northeastern and just the broader collection of institutes like the Broad Institute. How many of you are familiar with I want to see a show of hands, with a court case that the Broad Institute just won? Okay, one of you. Good for you. Do you want to say what it is? Okay.
Oh yeah.
So there's a technology called Crispr for gene editing that was sort of simultaneously designed and developed in a couple places in the country. But the courts had to decide who kind of got technical credit for the patent. And the courts just decided that the Broad won. And it's very technical. Nobody disputes, by the way, that Berkeley did amazing work and really foundational work. It was a question of technically where those lines are drawn. The economic impact of this, somebody estimated, could be $100 billion of value that flows to the Broad Institute as a result of this. 100 billion. That's blows away most college endowments, right? So that kind of value is likely to flow to a building just a couple blocks from here that is doing research, really basic research and inspiring basic research in genetics. So this is what Cambridge is. There's nothing like this on the planet. There's nothing like this in terms of the concentration of minds and the focus on deep tech. I would like to say that CIC actually is a relatively small and insignificant player in this picture. What we do is we create wonderful places for those startups that ultimately take those technologies and get that money to go actually develop what they're doing. And I think we're very good at that. But we're kind of at the end of that chain. And the start of that chain is the research that takes place at places like MIT and Harvard and in places like the Broad Institute, the capital that comes from the investors here. And because we're so good at this, the world's investors that are willing to take those big leaps of faith to invest in deep tech, they're all here. And so this is a really good place to get that kind of capital. And many of those projects are going to fail miserably. That's okay. That's the whole game.
Tim, if I could offer just a small friendly addendum to what you were saying. One of the challenges, I was going to ask you, what's MIT like on a good day, or when MIT is what the world needs? To the question about deep tech, how much of the technology, the physical technology that MIT has on its campus for its researchers is opened up, and in what ways, to organizations and individuals that are trying to create something that is a commercial venture. And that's a very tricky, a very fraught kind of process. It is one that MIT wrestles with. The world has kind of competing expectations in that regard, right? I mean, some of that technology was in part developed with public money. And yet there is this hesitancy about turning that technology into the kind of stuff that creates businesses, that creates jobs, that creates stronger communities. It's a very complicated world.
But nobody does it better than MIT, is what I would say. There's a lot of puts
So
and
on
takes
that
there.
note, I think we're
No, really, nobody does. So what we're talking about is sort of technology transfer, development of technologies that may have public backing into, say, private companies.
Yeah.
It was, I think, in 19 late 20s or 30s that Vannevar Bush, who was then dean of the School of Engineering at you know your stuff, at MIT, said, look, they were saying like, should we transfer this? And he said, yeah, we should. We're a mens at manus institution, and we should transfer these technologies of the institution into private hands so that they can be developed for the betterment of humanity. And that has been MIT's, there's actually a quote from him in the MIT Museum somewhere.
Yes.
That has been MIT's policy for a really long time, before anybody else cottoned on to the idea that this was, this is what you should do. And it does it better than anywhere else. And it's great, by the way, that you have Stanford and other institutions competing, because that's what makes us all better, Berkeley as well. But we are really, really good at this. And the developments in terms of capital concentration and concentration of talent here, this is going to be one of the most successful places in the world for a very long time to come.
Well, you voted with your feet and your energy and your financial resources as well, Tim. Thank you. I see Kathy has the microphone.
Yes.
As Dean Hawks, I should say.
We have one of our alums who will have to have the last question for students to get back to class. So if there's one thing that you could name that you would have done differently on your entrepreneurial journey, what would it be?
Well, we definitely had things that didn't work out, but I wouldn't, knowing what I knew at the time, like that was the thing to do, right? I don't know. I sometimes feel like we went too slowly. Like it took us a decade to build the second innovation campus. Or, we were founded in roughly 1999. It was more than a decade. 2013, 2014, we went to St. Louis. So I think I would sort of speed up that clock. But then I had little kids at home and I didn't really want to travel that much. And so I don't know, I'm pretty happy with it. There are many stupid mistakes that I've made, but I don't feel like you should have an expectation you won't make stupid mistakes. Like that is what it's about. Do your best, learn from something you did that was abysmally dumb, and then try not to do it that many more times.
That sounds like the note we're going to end on. Tim, let me just say for all of us here physically and on the web, thank you very much for today, for the contribution that you make to this region, and for being a leader in the MIT and Sloan School community. Thanks for all of it, Tim. Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah.